If you have a Bible to hand, if you could open your Bible in Genesis chapter 1, we'll be starting at the very beginning and going through the first 3 chapters of the Bible in great depth and then moving on from there. As I mentioned earlier, if we were expecting a religious book that was going to give us a system for understanding the world, if we were writing such a text or looking for such a text, we'd probably not start with something like the Bible. It does not look like the sort of book that we'd expect. It starts off with a story, and it starts off with a story that has unusual features. It has a sort of raised register, something more of a literary quality to it. If you read the story of creation, you can see there are 6 days that have some sort of symmetry to them, and they play out in a way that's like bringing a great dance into effect. It's as if God is the choreographer, and he's starting this great dance and introducing different partners at different points. Or alternatively, you could think about it as a piece of music. On the first day, God sets up the beat. Evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning. The creation of light is the creation of time. Not just this body of light, but a state of light, the day. And going further, you can see this pattern becomes elaborated. On the 4th day, for instance, when light is no longer just the light of this single light, but the lights of the sun, moon, and stars. And this articulated light, not just day and night, evening and morning, but times and seasons and years. There is this broader structure that gets created in time. Now, I mentioned this sort of symmetry to Genesis chapter 1, and you can see that in the way that the first 3 days and the second 3 days can be mapped onto each other as essentially a structure of forming and filling. So God forms something, and then on the next day that corresponds to it, he fills it. So the first day, day 1, God creates the light. And then on the 4th day that corresponds to that, he creates the lights, the sun, moon, and stars. On the 2nd day, God creates the waters above and the waters beneath, the firmament that divides. On the 5th day, God populates that. Birds to fly across the face of the firmament, fish to fill the seas. On the 3rd day, God creates the land from the waters and fills it with vegetation in 2 acts of creation. And on the 6th day, corresponding to that, the Lord fills the earth with the beasts, the living creatures, human beings. And the human beings are created in that 2nd act of creation on the 6th day. And then the 7th day is the crowning day, the day of the Sabbath. Now, what you've seen within that fundamental structure is a structure in time, among other things. It's a structure where you start off with the basic beat, evening, morning, evening, morning. The 4th day, you have the elaboration of that with the sun, moon, and stars and the dividing of the times and seasons. And on the 7th day, you have the completion of the pattern, the fundamental pattern of the week leading to a day of rest. And that rest is not just refreshment, recharging for the work, the sense that we need to live that day of rest under the rubric of work as a state of preparation for the next day of work, but as a distinct state. It's a time of rest, a time when we step back. It's a day that is not just there to give us a breath, but it's a day that is set apart and holy, a day that enables us to step back so that time is not just a stream of consciousness for the whole of our lives, but it's articulated, it's punctuated. And as you go through the rest of the Pentateuch, in the institution of the Sabbath, it's not just 1 day and 7. It becomes this larger structure that orders the year, and then orders many years. It's played out in the feasts, 7 special days of gathering, 7 feasts. And then it's the 7-day feasts, the feast of unleavened bread and the Feast of Tabernacles. And then there's the 7s connected with the Feast of weeks or Pentecost, 7 sevens, and then you celebrate Pentecost. And then it's played out on the level of the year. The 7th month is the month where most of the festal events take place. And then you go further and you see it's played out on the level of years, where the 7th year is the year of release. And then you have the 7 times 7s with the year of Jubilee, the great year, the year where everything is restored. And so these patterns of time and these patterns of space being filled and populated are fundamental to Genesis chapter 1. It provides a sort of structure that gets played out elsewhere in Scripture. If you read Exodus chapter 25 to 31, the building of the tabernacle, you can see those same 7 days of creation played out in the structure of the tabernacle. And each one of the elements within the tabernacle can be mapped on to a particular day in sequence. And as we go through the Scripture, we can see that this is a way of thinking about reality that maybe is strange to us. There is a choreography, a dance into which we have been introduced, and there are resonances between the different parties. You can see the way that it involves different phases. The phase of forming, where God says, "Let there be light," and light is formed. Or he forms the firmament, dividing the waters above from the waters beneath. It's the fundamental architecture of the world. It's the fundamental setting of the stage, as it were. Whereas on the second set of 3 days, God is filling. He's delegating rule. He's giving his world over to parties that will continue its patterns. And already at the end of it, we have a sense that the world is not finished. The world is waiting for agents to actually live out the fuller pattern that God has intended. He's set in motion, but there are sub-creators. Man and woman are instructed to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and exercise dominion over all of its creatures. The world isn't finished. God has set things in motion. He's established a pattern. And man and woman are given the task of bringing this through to a greater completion. And so we have this day of rest, but there's also this expectation of maybe a greater rest, when this greater work of filling and ordering the world has been done. Now, going through the account, we may notice that there are similarities with man and woman already introduced in the preceding verses. For instance, we see the introduction of being fruitful in day 5, where the fish of the sea and the birds of the air are instructed to be fruitful and multiply. They're given that capacity. Whereas formerly God filled the heavens with the stars and he put all these other structures in place, now the creation itself is being given generative potential, the ability to make something more. And we can also see different ways in which God relates to his world. That transcendent word, "Let there be," and calling forth from nothing something into being. The first day of creation, God's great word in making light. And then you go further on and you see God is engaging with his world in a sort of hands-on way, fabricate. He makes the firmament. Not just a word spoken, but something that's formed and fashioned. And then you go further and God says, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation." There's a sense in which God is giving agency and power and potential to the creation itself, that by his Spirit it would be a bearer of the gift and the power of life under him. And so this movement through these different forms of creation suggests that God is related to his creation, not just in a sense of the transcendent voice of command calling it into existence, but as one who is hands-on, as one who is dwelling within his creation, and as one in whom his creation dwells. In him we live and move and have our being. And so the creation is surrounded by God's power, and it becomes empowered by God's power. The creation is formed according to higher and ultimately divine patterns, which are impressed upon and refracted through realities of lower eminence. So we have on the first day, God creates light. What is that light? is that the sun? No, it's not the sun. It can't be the sun. That's created on the fourth day. What is the light of the first day? We could think of it, maybe, some have suggested, as the Shekinah glory, God's own glory. And perhaps that's the case. Maybe it's the glory of the heavens. But whatever this light is, it's not the lights that we see in the heavens. Those are a lower manifestation of that higher light. And so we have these different levels of creation that are related to each other, where the higher reality can be represented and impressed upon the lower reality through these structures of analogy. We'll see this as we go forward into the second account, as it were, of creation in chapter 2, where the heavens get represented in the realm of the garden, which is a sanctuary upon the earth. So it's as if a model in miniature of the greater reality is within that greater reality. It's like a nested Russian doll. We can also see that there is this structure of binaries within the creation. Heaven and earth, land and sea, day and night, sun and moon. And these are not antagonistic relationships. They're dynamics and they're pairings that are asymmetric, but yet also mutually establishing. These are structures that are good and beautiful and together form dynamisms. And there's a sense also of a comprehensive dimension of the creative order being represented by the interplay between each one of these things, day and night, the relationship between the heavens and the earth. And we can see that even in the creation of man. The creation of man and the creation of woman after is a relationship between heaven and earth. The breath of God breathed into dust and clay from the earth. And so there's a marriage of heaven and earth even in our very frames. And then this is also related to a world that is first formed and then populated. There's forming and then filling and delegation. And already then within the creation account, this is not just a list of things that happened. This is giving you a sense of how the world works, the sort of thing that it is, the sort of place that we have within it. You can see this also in the way that there are structures of rule and delegation established within the earth. The sun and the moon established in the heavens, where the sun and the moon, as these two great lights to rule the day and the night, correspond in some ways with man and woman, created as two great lights to rule in the earth and over the fish of the seas and birds of the air. Later on in Genesis, Joseph will tell his dream. He saw the sun and the moon bowing down to him and the 11 stars. And Jacob, his father, knows, obviously, the sun and the moon refers to father and mother. And there's a sense of a resonance there in many different ways that is explored within the account. Now, this is rather different from a set of rules and roles. There's a sense here of a world that is dynamic, charged with life and potential and glory and beauty, and human beings are created to be means creatively to express and extend that, to bring into the world a fuller form of beauty and glory and order. We fill the earth. We are fruitful and multiply. We fill it. Now you can see that there is a progression that's very natural there. You are fruitful. As you're fruitful, you multiply. As you multiply, you fill. And then as you fill, you subdue the earth and you exercise dominion over its creatures. And so each phase of that is an outworking of this fundamental relationship between man and woman. The other thing that we should notice is that there's a continuity between creation and providence. Creation itself establishes the patterns and the potencies that are outworked in ongoing creational providence. Delegation is also internal to God's acts of creation. God's creative labors can be upheld and continued in the activity of the beings that he has created. The sun and the moon and the stars are an ordered hierarchy upholding the great temporal division of the first day, day and night. And the fertile creatures continue the filling work that God initiated in his creation of them. We've noted that creation is densely temporal. The establishment of temporal structures bookend the creation week, day and night, and the Sabbath, and also lie at its heart, sun, moon, and stars. And then we can see also that creation is good in each aspect of its rich variety. In particular, God creates something and he'll look at that thing in particular and say, that is good. And then he steps back at the end of the sixth day and says it's all very good. It's good in its particularity, and it's also good in its relations and the way it is interlocked. God delights in a proliferating yet well-ordered variety and difference, and he calls us to share in and to call forth his pleasure. That we, in the expression of our variety and difference and our relations, should be to God's glory and praise, and also share in part of his joy as we experience joy in living this out. The vast company of created beings is bound together by a multifaceted order of the wider creation in which all of its members are placed. The other thing we should notice is that the created world is a commons. It's to be shared between diverse beings with their overlapping claims upon it. No creature has absolute title to the creation, but all must accommodate themselves to the claims of other creatures, cognizant of their diverse needs. The food that is given to human beings is also given to the animals. It's maybe interesting sometimes when we read the creation account to focus on the animals. I often joke with my wife that we need to think maybe more about, instead of creator-creature relation and things like that, think about creator-critter relation. It's a bit more humbling, and it gives us a sense more of how we fit into the picture and our kinship with the animals. We are critters, and we belong to this order where we have to share with them. They are our fellows in some way, and occasionally they might even talk back to us like Balaam's ass and help us to recognize that Balaam himself is compared to his ass. And so, in more ways than one, perhaps. So when we're reading these stories, we can recognize the fittingness of these relationships, the way that the higher orders are reflected in the lower orders. As with the animals, the whole sacrificial system is premised upon an analogy between human beings and animals, that we are like the creatures, and the creatures can reflect us. And so if you have a bull, it can reflect the high priest and his place, or a goat, it can reflect the king. And so there's a social order that can be mapped onto the animal order because we are critters like them, and we are bound up with them. We share with them, and we inhabit the same realm. But yet, despite our commonality with the animals, we are set apart from them in a very notable way. The act of creating humanity is one that distinguishes humanity from the rest of the beasts, not least in the fact that God deliberates concerning our creation. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And so what we see is the creation of a distinct form of creature, alongside the other creatures, the same day of creation, and in a sort of kinship with the other creatures, but also different. We are not like the other creatures. We are set apart, and we're set apart for some purpose that makes us stand over against the rest of the creatures as a representative of their creator. We are created in the image of God. Now, this is a terminology that has been a source of great debate. What do we understand this to mean? Within biblical theology, there's generally agreement, broad agreement, that it refers to some sort of royal functional understanding. It's related to the way that a king, for instance, might place a representative or a statue, or a god might be represented by an image within his temple. And so human beings are there as a sort of royal functional representative and image of the Creator. It's the royal office or calling of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world, granted authorized power to share in God's rule or administration of the earth's resources and creatures. That's a quote from J. Richard Middleton. Among systematicians, some have argued for the image of God to be found in something different. So Karl Barth argues for the relationality that we see between man and woman as an image of the broader relationality that is within human beings, that is related to God's own sort of love. And then he argues that man and woman, if you go further on in the text, you can see that there's a sort of threefold parallelism. God creates man in his image. In the image of God, he creates him. Male and female, he creates them. And so there's a parallelism, threefold, but also something of a difference. God creates man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. There's singular and plural. He created him, he created them. There's also a sense of the broader type and the specific person, maybe the archetypal person of Adam. And as we go through the account, we can see that there is ambiguity over singular and plural. Man has both a singularity, him, and a plurality, them. The image of God is first spoken of as the singular man, Adam perhaps, whether in the sense of the entire concrete race or just that one individual. Human beings are a kind. We're humankind, a particular type of creature. We're a race descended from an original pair that grow out to fill the earth, but as a sort of large family. We're connected to each other and we develop over time. So we're a population that's not just a stable population of creatures who live forever, but we're a growing population. The angels seem to be more of a host. But human beings are also a host. We're a great company of people. We don't just think of human beings in terms of their relationship going back to Adam as part of this great human family tree, nor just in terms of our being part of the same kind. We also think of ourselves as hosts. For instance, the host of people here. We don't think necessarily that we all back to our common origins. We don't necessarily think back to our being just part of the same species. We recognize we're a host of people gathered for a particular purpose. And so as creatures created in the image of God, we already see there are different facets to that. It's not just a simple, straightforward thing. We are created as a pairing that has a potential to be elaborated. So you start off with the man and the woman, and after a few generations, you get a race. And you get other differentiations. You get generational differentiations. And so the fundamental difference is one productive of other differences. And as you spread out as a host and fill the earth, you start to develop different societies, and you develop different locations, and you develop different forms of custom and ways of being together. And so we see the seed of all these other forms of human difference already established in the creation of this first couple. There is also a way that this is more relational than just the categories of man and woman. It's the categories of male and female. If we're thought merely in terms of the sociological categories of man and wife, we might restrict this to the context of marriage. Now, marriage is important, but the relationship between male and female in society is broader than the relationship between man and wife. Even if we aren't married, there is a deep embeddedness within this order of male and female. We are sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. We are those who play out in every area of our lives something of what it means to be a man and a woman, and for us in particular, to be our particular sort of man and woman. And the primary purpose of this relation is not to invite us merely to think in terms of these narrow social relations, nor is it to see a sort of just narrow base biological difference. It's to help us to see the seed from which all these elaborated structures can arise. It's the core difference at the heart of society. Nor is this something that should be projected back onto God. There's always a danger that we sexualize God and see God maybe as an amalgam of male and female characteristics. Maybe God just has a feminine side in the Holy Spirit, and maybe he has a masculine side in the Father and the Son, and already we can see there's a sort of imbalance. Why are there two persons of the Trinity connected with the masculine side? These are problems that we can sometimes fall into. But the point is rather to see these things as downstream of their creator, not necessarily as things to be projected back onto the creator, but as things that reflect and manifest God's creative rule within the world. As male and female, we are fitted to do some of the things that God does in his work of creation. God renders things fruitful so that they might multiply. He fills things. And he creates us in ways that we might fill things. He creates us in ways that are differentiated so that there is an order to human relations and society. So that things like the division between the generations, between father and mother and son and daughter, that division might arise, that we not just be a host of individuals that are collapsing into each other. And so there is a sort of expression of God's variegated rule. We thought about this in terms of the transcendent word, let there be, and then the hands-on action, forming the firmament and things like that, and then the empowering word, let the earth bring forth, etc. This can also be expressed in the way that we have been created, to elaborate that order. And so, as we are created, we are delegated authority within the world. We are given capacity and potential to live out what God himself starts in the work of creation. And when viewed against this sort of background, it should be seen that man's capacity for procreation is more than just a prerequisite for representing God's rule within the cosmos. It's a creaturely analog to the Creator's power to exercise and delegate rule through the bringing forth of life. So God brings forth life and delegates rule in the same way human beings can procreate. We don't create in the way that God creates, but we procreate, and we delegate by teaching and training our children to take our place within the world, or to take a place within the world where they continue on the human calling. So both dominion, God establishing the fundamental structure, God naming these things. We only see acts of naming on the first 3 days. But also generation are seen within human activity too. Forming and filling. They're integral to God's creative rule. And they are delegated to human beings who are fitted for the exercise of them. Now, when we're thinking about the image of God, a noteworthy passage is Genesis chapter 5, where the same sort of language is applied to human relationships among themselves. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them. And he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. So there's something about our being in the image of God that has a sort of filial character. In the same way as a man can have a son, so human beings are like the sons and daughters of God. We are there to be taught our Father's business, and as we go through the chapter that follows, we'll see that. Just as a father might teach his son his trade, so God teaches Adam his trade. Just as God teaches man to occupy this realm that he has established, so we might teach our children to occupy a place within the world that we have established. Just as the father within Israel might help to find a bride for his son when he couldn't find one himself, so God finds a bride for Adam when he can't find one among the animals. Looking through these things in terms of the relationship between man and woman, it's important to think that the difference and the relationship between man and woman is explicitly presented as integral to the identity of mankind in the image of God. So our differences are not just indifferent. There's not an image of God that is to be seen primarily behind the difference between man and woman. The image of God is in more ways to be seen in that sort of difference. And that difference not just as a being over against each other, in sort of rivalry, or being individuals set in detached contexts, but in the dynamic that we have between us, we are fitted to represent God's rule. Now, each one of us is in the image of God, individually. But primarily, we find the image of God in the broader activity of human beings in relationship to each other. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 is not just a generic celebration of created diversity or of human relationality as such, but of a very particular difference and relationship that images and reflects God's rule and character in the world. No other differences or relations among human beings are given the significance that this one is given. We can think about the other differences that matter to us, the differences of generation. That's downstream of the difference between man and woman. The differences between ethnicity and race, that's downstream. The differences of human talent, the differences of human vocation, the differences of social location, all of these things are downstream of that fundamental difference. And this difference is also a difference that presents as integral to humanity, a sort of alterity, an otherness. Man and woman are represent the two-ness of humanity. You can think about two-ness in terms of the human body. We have two eyes, we have two hands, we have two ears. And in each of these respects, in the bringing together of those two, we can do things that we could not do with one alone. The sort of dexterity that we have, where we can maybe have a particular way of acting with our stronger hand, but there's an action together that enables us to grasp hold of reality. If we lost one of our hands, we would not be able to engage with reality in the way that we do. And those two are set over against each other as counterparts to each other, so that the one would be stronger for the other's presence. We have two eyes and thereby are able to see things in perspective and with depth. And humanity, as created man and woman, has a two-ness. There's a sense in which every one of us, as man or woman, is off balance, incomplete by ourselves, depending for that larger social, we need to exist in a larger social space with both men and women. Men and women also as different, within the larger society of interacting, having their own spaces and their own ways of doing things, their own ways of understanding themselves, but interrelated. And so, as we grow up, we'll often find that so much of what it means to be a man and a woman is taught to us by the other sex. We learn, for instance, there's a sort of maturity that comes to men and women as they spend time around each other, and certain of their tendencies are moderated in relationship to the other. They can play to their strengths, but they can also play their strengths to the other without being at odds. And so this two-ness to humanity, this non-competitive union, is at the very heart of what humanity is in the image of God. We are not fundamentally to find the image of God in detached individuals, but in persons bound together in mutually implicating relationships. And in an asymmetric order, we're not exactly the same. And that's one of the reasons why we're so effective together, because we are not the same. as something integral to the image of God, this particular difference in relationship is not to be treated as something to be embarrassed about, as something to minimize or downplay. It's something glorious and good that we want to live into and out. It's something we want to dress up. I mean, when we want to express the most glorious aspects of what it means to be ourselves as persons, what we'll often do is, for instance, in a great ball, dress up in a way that accentuates the fact that we are man or woman. And in that relationship, find a glory in whose glory we are more glorious. And so dressing up this reality is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing. I mean, doesn't mean we always have to accentuate it to the ultimate degree, but it's a good thing to be expressed creatively and in a way that expresses a fundamental freedom and glory that God created in us. The difference between man and woman and the relationship between them is integral to humanity's bearing of the image of God, the fulfillment of humanity's commission, and to the enjoyment of humanity's blessing. And through its unique relationship to the divine image, commission and benediction, this difference in relationship has divinely established symbolic value. It expresses our primary identity, vocation, and blessedness. And consequently, this is a difference in relationship to be proclaimed, elevated, and celebrated, not minimized. Even secondary cultural differences between men and women can be appropriate ways of accentuating the splendor and dignity of the differentiated image of God. The things that we express in customs, in things like hairstyles, in activities, and the different ways that we interact together. In contrast to the attempts of many to minimize or relativize gender differentiation and the importance of relations between the sexes, Genesis 1 presents this mysterious difference in relationship as something that lies near the heart of what it means to be created in the image of God, and thus as something to be celebrated in maturing expressions. The fundamental maleness and femaleness of humanity grants marriage some of its iconic value. Every marriage, in some sense, is an icon of humanity as a whole. In bringing together a particular man and a woman, there is something of the bringing together of the two halves, of the two hands of humanity expressed. Now, in many ways, this can be a case even in the lived experience of a marriage, where there is something of almost a recognition of the whole of the other sex in that particular woman or man that you are bound to. They are not just a detached individual. They are someone who stands for this larger body of humanity. And the way that you treat them and honor them has implications for the way that you honor this larger body of human persons. The way that you establish a dynamic with them is something that has implications for that larger dynamic of how men and women relate in society. Now, all of this is something that we'll explore later on in the New Testament as Paul reflects upon this fundamental creational order in places like 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Timothy chapter 2. But the crucial thing to see is that from the very outset, this is not presented in a series of thou shalt nots or thou shalts. It's presented as structural to the very reality that we live in. And this is one of the things that helps us to move beyond, to use the title, rules and roles, to recognize that this is embedded in reality itself. And so what we're doing when we live out what it means to be man and woman is creative and good, not just the obeying of certain commandments and restrictions, but actually living into ourselves. There is something also about this that means that since God is saying, this is how I created things, it has implications for when we're dealing with people who reject the biblical teaching. It's not as if God didn't create this reality in them. It's not as if they've got some private creation all of their own. They are living within God's world. these realities are still operative in them, even if they do not experience it on a visceral level because they've really been blinded to it in some ways. And as Christians, one of the best things that we can do is to draw people's attention to their very own reality, to show them, you are living this. You may not see it. You may not have the categories for it. You may experience it in toxic and damaging ways. On occasions, you might feel something of its liberating force. But this is reality itself. And the more that you experience it, the more that you'll find that the scriptural witness resonates with something in you. There is a twofold witness. And this is one of the things that's very important about emphasizing natural law. Natural law is not something that enables us to discount the witness of Scripture, to say that we can gainsay it, or to say that we are in a position to act in despite of it. Rather, this is something that is a secondary witness, confirming witness. Much of what we read in Scripture is natural law, elucidated and expressed in a way that it is not within our immediate experience. But there should be a sense as we proclaim this, and if we proclaim it well, of recognition. I see this within myself. This is true on some level. I may not have experienced it in good ways, but this is the reality that God has created. And so when we lead with rules and roles, we can have this sort of biblicist approach where people need to submit to God who, by some cosmic fiat, is saying you must do this, that, and the other. Creation, by beginning with the actual structure of reality itself, presents a different way of approaching the issue. Not saying that God is imposing this reality upon this plasticine world, but saying that this is the way that you have been created. God teaches us to live with the grain of our being. And as we live with the grain of that being, we will find that it is good. And there's something of a conviction that must underlie our approach to creation and our approach to Scripture, that God is good, that He has created us good, that biblical witness that God sees and declares it to be good, and then stands back and sees this relationship between man and woman that I've created, that's good. Or to see that situation where there is not yet a relationship between man and woman. God sees that it is not good for the man to be alone. That expression should just jar when we hear that. We've heard God saw it and said that it was good. Again and again, it's this refrain. And then there's a break of that refrain. God sees that it's not good. And our ears should perk up. We should recognize there's something here that the text wants us to feel. There's something awry in God's creation. How can it be awry in God's creation? Because there is not yet a fitting counterpart. There is not yet, as it were, a dance partner within the choreography of reality. The fulfillment of the human vocation entails a radical intervolvement, as we could call it, of man and woman. In creating humanity as male and female, God did more than just create a representative diversity of human identities or expression of generic human relationality. He established a very specific and definitive difference that would serve to form and to fill the human world, generative of its ordering structures, generational difference, family, differing realms, and forms of activity for men and women, etc. Fabrice Hajjaj, I can't pronounce his name rightly, writes, sex is the starting point of two types of relations, both of which depend upon difference. There is double difference, the difference between the sexes and the difference between generations. The first is concerned with relations between spouses, while the second is concerned with relations between parents and children. This double difference is the first difference experienced by every human being. In the relation man-woman or the relation parent-child, every one of us experiences a relation to an other, meaning towards a person who will never be me, who is irreducible. It is impossible to fuse with the opposite sex. because the person belonging to the other sex is an other par excellence. Men see women as belonging to a world that they will never penetrate. There's a lived reality that men and women share within their own sex that neither party can fully enter into. Even if a woman spends a lot of time in male spaces or a man spends a lot of time in women's spaces, they can never fully inhabit that world. It is similar in the case of parenthood. Children see their parents as those who belong to a wholly different world, and parents see the world of their children as wholly other. Now, obviously, there are ways in which we can relate to our parents and relate to our spouse and find commonality, but there is a sense of irreducible otherness. They will never become you, and in their otherness, they also hold something that implicates you. Your relationship with your parents is your relationship on some level with yourself. You are an icon of your parents. You are very literally the amalgam, the one flesh union of your parents. And so it's very hard to relate to yourself without your relationship to your parents being implicated. Likewise, it's very hard to relate to yourself well without having some implication in your relationship to the other sex, even if that's just to your parents as mother and father. And those relationships break with what we were talking about earlier in the individualistic framing of anthropology that we have in the West. Contemporary Western liberalism's conceptions of difference are founded upon a regime of individualism where the fundamental unit of social analysis, the most basic human reality, and the central object of expression is the autonomous, sovereign, androgynous, yet implicitly male, in many cases, individual. The differences between individuals are fundamentally expressive of our common autonomous individuality, and orders of identity that transcend, constrain, or impose themselves upon the individual person are almost invariably seen as threatening. God's creation of humanity as male and female challenges the core of this doctrine on a number of fronts. It presents a very contrasting vision of difference that is not merely an ultimate indifferent veneer over, while an expressive witness to the more basic reality of the autonomous and sovereign individual. So when we talk about gender today, that's often what people see. There's a sort of veneer over the autonomous individual that is choosing how to express themselves, what to be. That being is downstream from the fundamental being, a choosing individual who defines your own being. But this reality described in Genesis chapter 1 challenges the notion of the generic, sovereign, and autonomous individual through the attention that it draws to the natural reality of two different kinds of human persons, males and females, and the incongruence of sexed and generational existence with the liberal construct of autonomous and androgynous human persons in purely transactional relations. Human beings aren't androgynous creatures who come into existence independent of all others, as if we burst forth from little pods. We are conceived through the relations between a particular man and woman into a specific lineage and born in the wombs of a particular woman. Our most basic human relations are structured by the natural drama of sexual and generational relations and the differences between man and woman. The relationship between a mother and her child, as we thought about earlier, has a unique character to it. It's a form of a relationship that can't be experienced by a man. It's perhaps the strongest demonstration, as we thought about earlier, of the limitations of a model of human relations narrowly ordered around external transactional interactions. Second, mankind as male and female challenges the regime of individualism by calling us to think of humanity in more than merely aggregative terms. Humanity isn't merely the sum of all individuals. It's an ordered body of creatures. The significance of men and women is discovered in the fact that, for instance, we can represent the whole of the human race as the two counterpart and asymmetric halves of it. Thus, human beings are more than individuals, and humanity more than just the sum of such individuals. Humanity as a whole, ordered around the asymmetric pairing of male and female. And this challenges the realm of individualism by representing an unchosen difference rooted in the body, a difference that shapes and colors our very subjectivity in powerful ways, even apart from social mediation. By rooting the self in such givenness of the body, it troubles individualism. As bodies, their identities and their relations are unchosen and resist the logic of individualism. The male and femaleness of humanity threatens the pretensions of autonomous individualism by exposing our deep embeddedness in the objective order of the world. Our bodies are the point where any sharp opposition between me and world is broken down. My body is part of the world, it's also part of me. It's a place where the division between subjective and objective, between internal and external, breaks down. Being male and female is a truth about our bodies, and yet at the same time a truth about our very selves. I'm not just a generic person who has a male body. I am a man, and there is a sense in which my very interiority is implicated. You could think about this as a sort of Mobius strip, where the internality is the same as the externality. You trace it along, and it takes you inside and outside, and there's no inside and outside as opposed to each other. Each is connected to the other. It forces us to reckon also with the exteriority of the self, with the fact that the self precedes its choice and that it belongs to a natural order. We can think about the way that we are, before we have any subjectivity, before we have any volition, before we have any individual agency, we are bodies. We are born from a womb, and we have a particular place within the world as we're held by our parents. Before I ever chose anything, I was this. That's who I am. And that body, that objectivity, that givenness is good. It's one of the things that means that I'm part of this world, that I'm at home within this world. My body is not just an external expression of my interiority. It does express that to some extent, but it can never truly be entirely that. It's also something that my interiority is formed out of. As people interact with my body, as they show the mother's caress of her infant child, or that sense that that child, everyone's saying, that child shares your eyes, or that child has your mannerisms, or that child is very much bound up with the life of that family. In all of these ways, we recognize ourselves in our bodies as part of a world, as bound up with other people, as rooted in ways that individualism and liberalism simply can't account for. And we can see this also as we go through Scripture with the relationship, for instance, between the body and the land. We'll be exploring the Song of Songs later, and that is a very important dynamic that's explored within the song. The way in which the body and the land kind of resonate together. There's also a sort of poetic understanding that's fitting here. We tend to think of the more analytic ways of understanding in terms of science and breaking things down into their component parts and understanding them individually and then building up from there. But the world that God has created has a sort of poetic logic to it, where things are connected, where there are things on different levels that resonate with each other and move together. And so my experience of my body is like the land. It has its uncalled for and unconsidered cycles. I have to learn about my body. I don't understand what makes it tick and what its patterns are. I have to learn. Sometimes I might have some sort of issue with my body. Maybe I need to change something in my diet or work out something of my environment that's disagreeing with me. You can also recognize the way that there's a sort of life taking place within me that is beyond my choice. There's the life, and this is one of the things that we see increasingly, a war with that. The patterns of puberty, for instance, where your body undergoes changes and your psychology undergoes changes, and everyone's a bit crazy for a few years. But there's a sense that I'm experiencing something that is unchosen, that I share in common with other people of my sex, and that is me and isn't me in some sense. It's bigger than me. I'm participating in it. It's part of my body that's going on by itself. And my body mysteriously brings me to a realm of human existence that I share with half of the human race. It orients me in various ways, physically, erotically, emotionally, to realize my sexual identity through relations with the other sex. Now, there are ways in which that's just built into our very body form, the way in which the human reproductive system is not something that any of us has by ourselves. It's shared, the two halves. Male and female coming together are the human reproductive system, not just one by themselves. Fourth, being created male and female is a threat to such individualism, as it reveals the body, the very sight of the self, always already implicates us in relations of gift, duty, and responsibility to others. We were conceived to and born by specific parents. Our bodies, although our own, were received from others. My body has within it the DNA that arises from my parents. My body is a gift that I have received through my mother's bearing me to term. My body is something that is not my own. We are not our own. The scripture tells us this on many occasions. We are redeemed, we're bought with a price. But there's also a sense in which, as human beings, our very bodies should bear witness to that. Our bodies are connected to the world, our bodies are connected to other people. In turn, through sexual relations and procreation, we can give our bodies to others in ways that forge natural bonds of responsibility. Bodies come from other bodies and always bear the traces of those bodies within them in sexually differentiated ways. And there are great mysteries here. I mean, you can think about how these things play out in the context of marriage and procreation. The fact that there is a gift of bodies that lies at the origin of each one of us. That our bodies, our very existence, springs forth from an act of love, or an act that should be an act of love. That is a profound truth. And it's a truth that is increasingly under threat within a society that would technologize that process or seek to circumvent the ways in which we naturally come to existence. But there is a beauty to that every single child that is born should naturally be conceived by an act of love and in a relationship that is a place where they are not anonymous. They've been born into an act of love, a one-flesh union of which they are the expression. That is an amazing truth when you think about it and what it means for each one of us. There are no human beings being created male and female. Fifth, threatens autonomous individualism, as every human being is defined by a prior disjunction. We are either male or female. The individual is always located by this disjunction. There's a sort of fracturing where we are always off balance, one side or another. We're implicated in the other, but there's a fracturing of any human totality. Human life, as Julian Marias has put it, is sexuate. He writes, sexual activity is a small province of our life, but a very important but limited one, which does not begin with our birth and usually ends before our death. It is founded on the sexuate condition of human life in general, which affects all of life at all times and in all its dimensions. So the relationship, for instance, between me and my parents is a sexuate one. I relate to my mother and my father differently. Although they are both persons created in the image of God, there is a sense in which their relationship to me and my relationship to them is always one in which gender is at play. I'm their son, and they are my mother or my father. There is no asexuate, autonomous individual, no human being that isn't already installed into a very particular mode of human life that is either male or female, a form of life that by virtue of that character must be pursued in a sort of extrospective character. So we find ourselves by relating to others, not by turning in on ourselves. And finally, this male and femaleness of humanity challenges the sort of individualism in our society by opening us up to something beyond ourselves. There's a sort of opening up to transcendence It reveals that our bodies and ourselves are designed to find meaning and fulfillment in relationship to something greater than themselves, even just on the creational level. In sexuality, we encounter otherness, an encounter that enables us truly to become ourselves, to rise to our full stature. Both man and woman have, as noted earlier, only one half of the human reproductive system, and are physically and also typically, emotionally and sexually oriented to each other. And through this relationship, we are open to the possibility of transcending ourselves, not least in the bearing of children, or in being part of a one-flesh union, where you find yourself acting in different ways because you're always relating to this other person who's become part of your own internal processing in some ways. And when we think about this, I think it really stands opposed to the sort of sexuality that is practiced in our society, where there's a sort of fear of otherness. When you encounter someone who's different from you, another human being, made in the image of God, there's a sort of abyssal quality to that. What do they see when they see me? I can't penetrate their interiority. And there's something terrifying about that when you think about it. You think about all the fullness of your interiority, look into anyone else's eyes, and that same thing is found on the other side. It's like looking from a great height, and you realize this interiority is everywhere in each other human person. And when I'm relating to another person sexually, that is relating to me. I'm exposed to them. There's nakedness there. And that sort of relationship is horrifying for people who are scared of otherness. And so our society is so often a way to escape that terrifying encounter with otherness through reduction to sameness, or having what we might call emotional prophylactics to avoid actually encountering someone who's another human being made in the image of God, who might see you. Think about the ways that we develop technique or focus upon the spectacle. Pornography is a great example of this. People acting out something in a spectacle rather than actually seeing another human being in the image of God. And when we look at what it means to be human beings created to know God, who is truly and radically other, He's our creator and we're the creature. That is something that we can be prepared for or dulled to by the way that we encounter creaturely otherness, something Paul gets into in Romans 1. The way in which when people refuse to acknowledge God as God, they start to lose the ability to see human beings in their otherness, the otherness of male and female. The reality that is greater than ourselves is not merely the human reproductive system, but the sexual relationship, a reality that can only truly exist where there is an asymmetric encounter with the otherness of the human sex, of the other sex. Fabrice Hajjaj, however you pronounce his name, I can't pronounce it. He's French, I think, but he writes, "It's an opening onto drama in which we are engaged by the body." Again, think of the otherness of the body. This drama assumes a relationship to what is radically other, however, not external. For example, femininity is for the man something that does not give him peace. It is otherness par excellence. Yet a woman is not other in the sense of something foreign and external. It does not belong to pure exteriority. It's simultaneously something internal to man. I cannot reduce a woman to my eye. I cannot have her as I have myself. However, in a relationship to the one whom I cannot possess entirely, I become myself. This is the model of sexuality. Something like this is called transcendence. Transcendence is not exteriority. It is something that is radically other, but simultaneously is here. It is an otherness, but not one that is non-present and is not foreign. So in creating humanity with this specific asymmetry, God placed a fundamental otherness at the heart of the race, a deep engagement that arises from that with embodied otherness as the source of its procreative potential. And such an encounter and engagement with created otherness is like a first preparation for deeper forms of transcendence, the opening up of the self to others, whether we're married or single, the otherness of the relationship with my parents, mother and father, the relationship of brother and sister, the relationship that we see within the church with our brothers and sisters, or the relationship with husband and wife. It's a way in which we can be prepared for the transcendence of a relationship with our Creator.